She lifted him when he had nothing, and he became the one who could lift her above everyone. It was one of those quiet, almost invisible afternoons when the world seemed to slow down, and I found myself in a small, sunlit cafe tucked between old bookstores. The kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee beans, polished wood, and old paper, a smell that somehow felt like a refuge. I was sitting alone, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup, the steam no longer offering warmth, just a reminder of how solitary I'd become. And then she walked in. Her presence wasn't loud or dramatic. She didn't command attention the way some people do. But there was something quietly magnetic about her, the kind of confidence that doesn't need to shout. She moved with a calm precision, a subtle elegance that made her seem out of place, yet perfectly at home. Her hair caught the afternoon light in gentle waves, and the soft lines of her face hinted at experiences lived fully, neither hiding her age nor clinging to youth. She was in her 40s, I could tell. Not that it mattered, except that in a world where I felt small and unremarkable, she seemed unreachably grounded. I noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she glanced around, eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity, yet she didn't seem to need approval from anyone. Her clothing was simple but carefully chosen, a soft sweater in muted tones, the kind that suggested both comfort and sophistication. And there was a scent, delicate, something like vanilla and morning rain, that lingered in the air, subtle enough to pull my attention without announcing itself. For a moment, our eyes met, just briefly, and yet it was like someone had set off a small spark in a quiet room. I quickly looked away, embarrassed by how strongly I felt it, even though nothing had happened. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, warm, not flirtatious, just acknowledging. It was the kind of smile that makes you feel seen without judgment. And then she moved on, ordering her coffee, unaware, or maybe perfectly aware, of the effect she had on me. I couldn't focus on my own drink after that. My thoughts kept circling back to her. The gentle sway of her hands as she reached for her cup, the careful way she cradled it, the soft hum of her voice when she spoke to the barista. Every movement seemed effortless yet intentional, and I realized I was comparing myself to her calm composure, my own nervous energy feeling like clumsy interference in the stillness she naturally created. And yet, there was no intimidation, only curiosity. I found myself hoping for a moment, any small moment, where I could somehow interact with her, however fleeting. That quiet longing, subtle and unspoken, was the start of something I couldn't name yet. She had entered my world, just briefly, and left it subtly brighter. I didn't know how or why, but I felt like life had shifted slightly in her presence. That day, I left the cafe carrying more than a cup of cold coffee. I carried the memory of a glance, a quiet smile, and a presence that would linger in my thoughts longer than I expected. In that single encounter, the slow burn had begun, unspoken but undeniable. She had seen me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint pull of possibility. A few days after that first encounter, I found myself back in the same cafe, hoping, without admitting it even to myself, that she might be there again. And she was, sitting at a corner table by the window, sunlight spilling over her, casting a soft halo around her hair. She looked calm and completely absorbed in a notebook, pen gliding effortlessly across the page. There was an ease about her that contrasted sharply with my own fumbling thoughts. I felt the familiar pull in my chest, the quiet curiosity that had taken root the moment our eyes had met. I had barely managed to sit down with my laptop when I realized I was stuck on a problem I had been struggling with for weeks. It wasn't just work. It was a mixture of self-doubt and uncertainty, the kind that makes every small decision feel like a test I'm destined to fail. I glanced toward her, almost apologetically, as if my presence alone might be an interruption to her composed world. And then she noticed, not in an intrusive way, but in that way people notice when something or someone needs quiet care. She stood and walked over, carrying a calm authority that felt reassuring rather than imposing. "Trouble with this?" she asked softly, nodding toward my laptop. Her voice wasn't patronizing. It was steady, patient, like she had all the time in the world to help, even if she didn't know me. I hesitated, embarrassed. I can't seem to get it right. I admitted, my fingers hovering awkwardly over the keyboard. She smiled, not the faint, polite one from before, but a warmer, encouraging smile that reached her eyes. "Sometimes the simplest way to start is to break it down into smaller steps," she said, pulling a chair over and sitting beside me. She leaned in slightly, just enough that the warmth of her presence brushed against my shoulder, her hand briefly grazing mine as she pointed to the screen. The touch was almost accidental, yet left a subtle ripple of calm in me, a grounding sensation I hadn't realized I'd been craving. She guided me gently, asking questions that made me think instead of handing me answers. Her patience wasn't just helpful, it made me feel capable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet spark of confidence. The room seemed to fade around us. The hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the warm smell of coffee blending with her subtle perfume. Everything receding into the background except her presence. And then there were the small, human details. The way she brushed a stray hair behind her ear, the soft crease of concentration on her forehead, the faint laugh she let out when I made a clumsy mistake. Each movement, each subtle gesture, conveyed warmth and reassurance. I was learning something deeper than the work in front of me. I was learning what it felt like to be seen without judgment, to be quietly lifted by someone who didn't demand anything in return. By the time she left, I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing it. Her smile lingered, her quiet confidence echoing in my chest long after she walked away. That brief encounter wasn't just support, it was a gentle awakening. She had offered more than advice. She had offered a glimpse of belief in me, and for the first time, I wondered what it might feel like to rise, even slightly, in the warmth of someone's quiet care. It happened one rainy evening, the kind where the sky feels heavy and every sound is muffled by the persistent drumming of water against the pavement. I had somehow ended up at the same little cafe again, seeking refuge not from the rain outside, but from the thoughts swirling inside my head, thoughts I rarely admitted to anyone. She was there, sitting near the window, the soft golden light of a lamp illuminating the curves of her face. She looked up as I entered, and our eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between us. Without a word, she gestured to the empty chair across from her. I hesitated, suddenly aware of how much I wanted to sit there, not just because it was a chair, but because being near her felt safe. We spoke quietly at first, about the mundane things, the rain, the coffee, the soft jazz playing in the background. But gradually, a pause in conversation stretched long enough for me to notice the tightness in my chest, the way my fingers fiddled nervously with the corner of my notebook. I took a deep breath and, almost without thinking, started to speak about things I'd never voiced aloud. The failures that haunted me, the moments of loneliness that seemed endless, the constant fear that I was not enough. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer cliches or try to fix me. She simply listened. And listening in that quiet, attentive way was more powerful than any advice. Her presence, steady, patient, and unwavering, made it easier to speak the words I had buried for so long. Her hand rested lightly on the table, occasionally brushing mine as she leaned in to hear me better, and the small, gentle touch seemed to carry reassurance with it, like a lifeline silently extended. When I finally fell silent, exhausted from the weight of my own honesty, she spoke softly. "I know what it feels like to carry things alone," she said, her voice calm but layered with emotion. "Even when life expects us to have it all together, it's okay to let someone see the cracks." Her words weren't sympathy, they were understanding. And in that moment, I realized something profound. She was no stranger to vulnerability herself. She shared a small fragment of her own life, not a dramatic confession, but a quiet admission of struggle. Something about her poised exterior now seemed human, delicate, and real. And it mattered to me more than I could have anticipated, because it made the space between us feel safer, more intimate. The cafe around us blurred into background noise, the clatter of cups, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, the rain tapping gently on the window. All that existed was the warmth of her presence and the delicate rhythm of conversation that had moved from superficial to profound without anyone noticing the shift. I realized then that trust was not just about words. It was about moments like this where silence and attention could hold more weight than anything else. By the time we left, stepping into the rain with umbrellas barely covering our shoulders, I felt lighter, strangely braver. The vulnerability I had shown didn't leave me weaker. It left me connected. And in her eyes, I glimpsed the same recognition, that we were both quietly, irrevocably changing each other. For the first time, I sensed that what had begun as curiosity was blossoming into something deeper, something slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It was a quiet evening when I first realized that something inside me had shifted. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that makes the warmth of another person's presence feel like a small, treasured gift. She had invited me to walk with her after work. A simple gesture, nothing formal, yet it carried the weight of familiarity that made my heart thrum in a way I hadn't expected. We wandered through streets glistening from an earlier rain, the soft reflections of streetlights dancing across the wet pavement. Every sound was amplified in the calm. Footsteps, distant laughter, the gentle hum of passing cars. And through it all, she moved beside me with effortless grace, her scarf brushing lightly against my shoulder whenever our steps brought us close. Those small brushes of fabric, almost accidental, made me acutely aware of her presence. Each movement she made seemed deliberate, yet natural, as if she existed in a rhythm the world didn't notice, but I could feel. We talked about everything and nothing. Work frustrations, the small triumphs of the day, the occasional absurdity of life. But there were pauses, delicate, unspoken spaces, where conversation gave way to observation. I noticed the way her eyes caught the light, how her lips curved when she smiled, the subtle tilt of her head when she considered something carefully. And I realized I was watching more than her gestures. I was absorbing the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence that seemed to make even the ordinary extraordinary. For the first time, I felt that familiar pang of admiration and desire. Not desperate, not overwhelming, but tender and insistent. It wasn't about physical attraction alone. It was about recognition. She had begun to see me as more than I thought I deserved, and in that acknowledgement, I found a growing courage. My own posture straightened, my steps fell surer, and my voice carried a steadiness I hadn't had before. There were touches, subtle yet charged with meaning. A hand briefly brushing mine when handing over an umbrella, shoulders lightly touching as we squeezed past a crowded cafe doorway, the warmth of her side against mine in close proximity. None of it was rushed or deliberate, yet every contact lingered in a way that words could never capture. Each touch, each glance, carried the unspoken promise of intimacy without urgency, the silent acknowledgement of feelings just beneath the surface. And then came the quiet, private moments, the shared laughter when a stray dog bounded past, the comfortable silence when we simply stopped to watch neon signs reflecting in puddles, the feeling of being understood without explanation. I realized that emotional awakening wasn't dramatic. It was in these small, almost imperceptible moments where closeness deepened, where admiration turned into something more tender and insistent. By the time we parted that evening, I felt it, an undeniable shift. The spark that had flickered in brief encounters was now growing into a gentle flame, steady and persistent. She had become a mirror in which I could see not just who I was, but who I might become. And as I walked home, the memory of her side against mine, the warmth of her brief touches, and the steady presence of her eyes in my mind left me feeling alive in a way I hadn't before. That night, I understood something essential. Love didn't need to announce itself with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it awakens slowly, quietly, in the spaces between words, in the brush of a hand, in the steady pull of someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself. It was one of those rare evenings when the world outside seemed perfectly ordinary, but inside, everything felt fragile. We had met at a quiet bistro. Her suggestion, casual, unassuming, but the air between us carried an unspoken weight I could no longer ignore. I had been feeling braver lately, walking taller, smiling easier, and yet tonight, hesitation crept in like a shadow I couldn't shake. She arrived, as always, composed yet radiant, her presence a quiet assurance. I noticed the way her coat fell softly around her shoulders, the subtle shimmer of her earrings catching the low light. But even in that familiar warmth, doubt tightened its grip around me. I loved being near her, yes, but I also feared it. The whispers of society, the weight of judgment, and most of all, the small, persistent voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough, pressed heavily against the growing bond between us. We exchanged greetings, polite smiles masking our inner turbulence. Conversations started naturally, flowing about books, music, and the faint clink of wine glasses. But somewhere between laughter and casual commentary, tension settled. I hesitated before sharing something I had been working on, an idea, a plan, a personal dream. Her eyes lit up as I began, encouraging and full of trust, but the moment I voiced my own insecurity, my words faltered. I don't know if I'm ready for this, I admitted quietly, staring at the table, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of her presence, her eyes searching mine, and yet the weight of my own fear seemed to fill the space between us. She reached across the table, hand hovering for a moment before lightly resting against mine. Her touch was soft, grounding, and yet it did not erase the tension. It simply reminded me that she saw me fully and without judgment. "It's okay to feel uncertain," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to have it all figured out. I see your heart in everything you do, even when you doubt it." Her words should have eased the ache in my chest, and part of me wanted to relax, to let her guidance pull me from my own hesitation. But fear is a stubborn companion. I worried about what others might think, about the unspoken rules I felt bound by, about the age difference and the lives we were living separately from one another. My pride and insecurity waged a quiet war inside me. And for a moment, I wondered if this connection, however precious, might be too fragile to survive the weight of reality. And yet, the subtle, human details kept me tethered. The warmth of her hand, the careful attentiveness in her gaze, the faint scent of her perfume that clung to the air even after she withdrew slightly. Even in conflict, even in hesitation, There was a pull I could not deny, a gravity in her presence that drew me closer to a truth I had long resisted. That vulnerability could be terrifying, but could also be the bridge to something deeply, profoundly real. By the time we parted that evening, neither of us had resolved the tension, but the silence between us was no longer empty. It was charged, electric with unspoken acknowledgement. We both knew that the path forward would require courage, patience, and trust, but for the first time, I realized that perhaps it was worth it. Perhaps the very hesitation I feared was the prelude to something extraordinary. It was a crisp, early evening when I first noticed the subtle shift in the balance between us. The world around us felt alive, but quieter somehow, like the city itself was leaning in to observe our small triumphs. We had arranged to meet at a modest art gallery. Her idea, casual yet intentional. And as I approached, I saw her already there, standing in front of a painting with that same quiet confidence I'd come to admire. I had been working on a project for weeks, something I'd struggled to believe in myself enough to complete. She had encouraged me, not with words of pressure or expectation, but with her steady belief that I was capable. And now, watching her, I realized that her quiet faith had given me more than confidence. It had given me courage. My steps felt surer, my chest a little lighter, as if her presence had infused me with an energy I hadn't known I possessed. When she noticed me, her face broke into that warm, steady smile that had first drawn me in. "You did it," she said softly, voice carrying pride without a hint of condescension. And I realized, in that moment, that her joy for my accomplishment was genuine, untainted by comparison or expectation. Her acknowledgement made the achievement feel larger than it was, more meaningful, because it had been witnessed by someone who saw not just the end result, but the struggle that led to it. And I wanted to do the same for her. Over the past months, I had noticed how often she tempered her brilliance with self-restraint, how her quiet humility sometimes hid the admiration she deserved. So, in my own small way, I made it my mission to lift her, to celebrate her publicly and privately. I suggested meetings, praised her insight, highlighted her contributions in ways that were understated yet intentional. Every small act, every gentle gesture was a silent acknowledgement of her worth, the same way she had nurtured mine. The subtle, human touches between us grew more intentional now, though never intrusive. A hand resting briefly on the small of her back as we navigated a crowded corridor. Fingers brushing as we passed a canvas back and forth. A shared glance that lingered long enough to convey pride, admiration, and something quieter, deeper, trust. Every touch, every glance, carried the weight of unspoken care. It wasn't just about success or recognition. It was about presence, about being there for each other when the world seemed indifferent, about creating a space where mutual respect and admiration became the foundation for something lasting. The city lights reflected off the gallery windows as we stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapping around us. I felt the warmth of her side against mine, subtle but grounding, and knew that the elevation we gave each other wasn't about power or dominance. It was about connection, affirmation, and quiet intimacy. By the time we parted that night, I realized something profound. We had both grown stronger, braver, and more certain of ourselves. Not alone, but together. In lifting each other, we had built a foundation of trust, respect, and affection that promised something enduring. The slow burn that had begun months ago had transformed into something tangible, undeniable, and deeply human. A connection that could weather hesitation, fear, and the world outside, because it had been forged in shared support and unwavering belief. The morning air was soft and golden, carrying the quiet promise of a new day. I found myself walking through the park, the crunch of frost underfoot echoing in the stillness, when I saw her waiting on the bench beneath the old oak tree. She looked as composed as ever, yet there was a softness to her expression that made her seem both approachable and radiant, like sunlight had chosen her as its home. I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed, and felt the familiar warmth of her presence settle over me. Over the months, we had moved from chance encounters to shared walks, quiet conversations, and subtle, intimate gestures. And now, sitting here in the calm, I understood fully how much we had changed one another. She reached for my hand, fingers curling around mine with gentle certainty. It wasn't a grand gesture, and yet it said everything: trust, affection, and a steady reassurance that we were in this together. I felt the pulse of her warmth under my skin, a rhythm that matched the quiet beating of my own heart. I realized that love, for us, had never been about urgency or display. It had been about presence, patience, and the unspoken support that allowed us to rise together. We spoke little at first, letting the quiet wrap around us like a blanket. When we did talk, it was about ordinary things: the soft rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the way sunlight made the frost glitter like tiny diamonds. But even in those mundane words, there was meaning. Every glance, every gentle brush of our hands carried the weight of months of growth, hesitation, and mutual care. For the first time, I saw her not as someone distant and unattainable, but as a partner in every sense of the word. The confidence I once admired from afar had never been arrogance. It had been strength honed by experience. And in that strength, she had allowed me to find mine. Likewise, the support and small affirmations I'd offered her over time had lifted her, given her space to shine freely without fear of judgment or diminishment. The world around us faded into the background. The park, the morning sun, the crisp air, all blending into a quiet stage for the culmination of our journey. I felt her head tilt slightly, resting lightly against my shoulder. Her hair brushed against my neck, soft and real, grounding me in the present moment. And in that simple, unspoken gesture, I understood that everything, the hesitation, the support, the small touches, the quiet encouragements, had led us here. There was laughter, too, gentle and warm, a sound that carried the relief of vulnerability finally met with understanding. Our fingers intertwined naturally, without need for explanation, a subtle promise that whatever the future held, we would face it together. We had lifted each other, supported one another, and in doing so, discovered the depth of a love that was slow, deliberate, and enduring. As we sat there, quiet and content, I realized that the slow burn had reached its quiet peak. No words could fully capture it. No grand gestures were necessary. We had found our equilibrium, a shared space of trust, warmth, and unshakable connection. And in that stillness, I understood that love could be quiet, patient, and infinitely deep, just like her, just like us.